Lecture 5, Prayer.
Hi, welcome back. We are now going to be looking at the second of Shimon the Righteous's tripod of what the world stands on. The first leg of the tripod was Torah, and so we talked about Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, last session. Now we're going to be talking about avodah, which should properly be translated as worship or service. But we're really going to be talking about prayer and the development of prayer from the biblical period to the rabbinic period, looking at some modern reformulations of prayers in the 19th and 20th century as well. And in between, we'll talk about the rise of the prayer house or the synagogue. The reason why I said that prayer, that avodah, should really be translated as worship or service is because in the Bible, avodah is almost always referring to animal sacrifice, the animal sacrifices that happened either in the tabernacle, according to the first 5 books of the Bible, or later on in the temple in Jerusalem. But there's one verse in Deuteronomy that talks about the worship of the heart. So we're not talking about open heart surgery here. So the rabbis understand that worship of the heart must be talking about something other than animal sacrifice, therefore it's talking about prayer. So although there's that one portion of the Torah that seems to be referring to worship of the heart as opposed to sacrificial worship, generally in the Hebrew Bible, that term avodah refers to sacrificial worship. But that doesn't mean that the idea of prayer isn't widespread in the Torah. Indeed, it is. Very frequently in the Bible, we have prayer that involves a request or a petition. For instance, we have a motif throughout the Hebrew Bible of the women being barren and needing to pray to God in order to open up their womb. In the first instance that I'm going to mention, Isaac, who's married to Rebekah, sees that Rebekah is barren and pleads with God to open up his wife's womb. A nice thing for a husband to do. Steps up to the plate and prays to God for his wife. We also see that Moses prays for his sister Miriam when she is afflicted with some kind of strange disease, and he prays for her full healing. I don't want to give you the impression that only men in the Hebrew Bible pray. Hannah in 1 Samuel also prays. She's another barren woman to continue this motif. And she prays for a child, and she says that if she gets this child, she will dedicate it to the Lord. And Hannah's child actually becomes the first prophet, Samuel. Other prayers in the Hebrew Bible aren't specifically about petition, but they're about praising God and God's work. For instance, Psalm 92 begins, "It is good to praise the Lord, to sing hymns to your name, O Most High." So it's a song of celebration. Many of the Psalms originally were set to music, and they still have musical notations in them, like Selah. Selah is a popular word. It's also a not uncommon name for girls, usually. Not Stella, Selah. And the idea of the musical notation has been lost. We know that it had something to do with conducting the music, but we don't know exactly what Selah means. Other psalms are for individual worship, like "Oh, I am in distress," or "Oh, it is good for me to praise you and your works, and the mountains should sing, and the hills should leap in order to acclaim God's greatness." Other psalms seem to clearly be communal, where it's the entire community, like Psalm 105, for instance, that is singing God's praises. There's also a series of psalms, Psalm 120 to 134, that begins with the superscription. It begins with the first few words, Shir HaMa'alot, a song of ascents. Now this is very interesting because what scholars speculate is that the Levites would stand on the steps of the temple, and there were 15 steps, and you have 15 psalms that begin with that superscription, a song of ascents. So they would stand on the steps, not exactly like the Mormon Tabernacle Choir, but sort of like the Israelite Temple Choir, and they would sing, and in many cases, the singing would be communal or antiphonal. So they would sing a verse, and then the congregants in the courtyard, the Israelites in the courtyard, would then sing back a refrain. And so we see this in, say, Psalm 136, where you've got different verses, and then the refrain is, for God's Ki leolam chasto, for God's mercy is everlasting. One of the interesting things about the rise of synagogues, synagogue is a Greek word that means a house of worship, or a house, not a house of worship, a house of assembly, house of gathering, is that we see the rise of the first synagogues already in Egypt in the 3rd century BCE. Now, these buildings seem to have been more prevalent in the diaspora outside of the land of Israel than inside the land of Israel until about the 3rd century. By the 3rd century, you have synagogues all over the land of Israel as well. The earliest synagogues were communal meeting houses in addition to prayer houses. So they filled all kinds of community needs. Now, this is important because as synagogues develop before the temple is destroyed, they're not necessarily challenging the exclusive centralization of worship in Jerusalem, at least those synagogues that we see in the land of Israel. Outside the land of Israel, you certainly have more prayers happening in the synagogues because they simply don't have the kind of convenient access to the temple in Jerusalem that the folks who are living in the land of Israel have. One of the things that's also interesting about the synagogues is that we have pretty good evidence that the Pharisees, who, as I said before, were the most popular of the sects of late Second Temple Judaism, weren't involved in the leadership of the synagogues. And then after the temple was destroyed, the rabbis also were not involved in the leadership of the early synagogues. Why do we know this? Because contemporary archaeologists, in their digs in these sites, both in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel, have found gorgeous mosaics of representational art in the synagogues, including depictions of biblical scenes like Abraham sacrificing his son Isaac, not quite sacrificing, but having the knife in his hand, as well as constellations and different kinds of astrological representations in the synagogue itself. We know that the Pharisees and the rabbis would have been uncomfortable with that because of their commitment to a rather strict interpretation of one of the commandments in the Decalogue, which prohibits representational art. So whoever was the leadership of these synagogues in the land of Israel and outside the land of Israel must have been at least strong enough to override that Pharisaic concern. One interesting note is that also the constructions of the synagogue don't suggest that there was any separate seating for women. And we have names of women who were actually leaders of their congregations. Now, we know from the Talmud that the rabbis had some problems with women leading services, although technically there isn't a problem, but on the practical level there would be some problems, and that has continued into orthodoxy unto this day, where women don't participate in the leadership roles during the prayer service itself. But we find in the earliest synagogues that women, there certainly isn't a separate women's section, so one piece of speculation is that women might not have been there at all. I doubt that, but it's always a possibility. And certainly there were some women who were leaders within their own synagogue communities. As the temple is destroyed, what we have at Yavne, remember Yavne is where Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai was spirited out from the burning city of Jerusalem and he established that first academy at Yavne. What they did at Yavne was to create a kind of template of what each prayer service should contain. Up until that point, prayer was spontaneous and it was individual, and it had to do with whatever spoke to the individual prayer at that moment, whether it was praise or whether it was petition or whether it was thanksgiving, right? After having done really well on an exam, you want to give thanks to the Lord because after all, you had prayed to do really well in your petitionary prayer before you took the exam. So what the sages of Yavne did was to fix a general order for the central prayer, which is called the Amidah. The Amidah literally means standing up, and Jews say this prayer in a standing posture. And the first prayer book that we really know about comes at the earliest in the 8th century, probably the 9th century of the Common Era. So what the prayer book has are not just a fixed order of the prayers, but actually fixed words for each blessing. In the Amidah, in that central prayer, there are 19 different blessings, and we'll talk about what some of those blessings are in just a moment. But at the very earliest stage of prayer development in Yavne, there wasn't that fixed formula for each blessing, but just a general sequence of how the prayers should unfold. Avodah, worship, had generally been performed through the sacrificial system during temple times, as I mentioned. But worship of the heart was interpreted by the rabbis to mean prayer. Now, the rabbis in the Talmud dispute whether or not the prayer services were instituted by the patriarchs or as a replacement to the now defunct sacrificial system, right? And they present arguments on both sides. Abraham instituted the morning service, and Isaac instituted the afternoon service, and Jacob instituted the evening service. And they say no, or the other side of the argument says no. There's a morning service and an afternoon service that involved animal sacrifices, and prayer is just coming to substitute for that. Their conclusion is very interesting because what they're not really arguing about history. The rabbis in the Talmud, right? They're not so plugged into history. That's not what motivates them. They're arguing about whether or not prayer is personal, individual, and spontaneous, right? Coming from the patriarchs, or whether, like the sacrifices, they're communal and institutionalized. Their answer, in a way, is both, but they claim that prayer was originated by the patriarchs. So the ideal for prayer is to be personal, spontaneous, individual, but then it was institutionalized in order to correspond to the sacrifices in the temple as a memory, as a reminder of those sacrifices in the temple. So it's important as we move into the medieval period and the modern period to remember that the ideal kind of prayer for the rabbis was indeed coming from the prayer's heart rather than something that was found to be in a fixed text in the prayer book. Okay, if we open up the traditional Orthodox prayer book today that goes back to the 8th century, that first prayer book that we talked about, and those ideas themselves go back to the Talmud, one of the first things that we see in the morning service is a description of creation. And there is a repeated line that God daily renews creation. God daily renews creation. Now, if you think back to Genesis 1, Genesis 1 presents the creation of the world as a fait accompli. God created the world in 6 days. On the 7th day, God rested, and that was it. Creation was historical. But for the rabbis, for the poets of the liturgy, creation is ongoing. Because what the poet is trying to get the prayer to buy into is this idea that God's providence and activity in the world is not merely historical, but it's ongoing. And so by saying that God daily renews creation, we're supposed to see the sun rising in the morning and reflect on God's creation of the sun at that moment in order to feel closer to God's activity on a daily basis. There's another section of the morning prayer service that alludes to Isaiah chapter 45, verse 7. The liturgist takes that verse and tweaks it a little bit. What the verse actually says is that God forms light and creates darkness, makes peace and creates evil. Creates evil.